Oh, it's working. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are in attendance. A few housekeeping rules before we begin. If members of the public in attendance need to use the facilities, they are located back through the main doors. If there is a fire alarm, please leave the building by the nearest fire exit, which is here, and make your way to the concourse by the multi-storey car park. On my right hand, just for your information, are the PCC officers, and on my left-hand side, we've got the legal officer to help us. Can I also remind you to put your phones on silent during the meeting? Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence. Can I ask Democratic Service Officer if there are any apologies for absence or lateness?
Thank you very much, Jace. I've received apologies from Councillor Harper, for Councillor Jamil, Councillor Dennis Jones and Councillor Warren, and in substitutions we have Councillor B and Councillor Simons.
Thank you. Item 2, declaration of interest. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? Councillor Hussain.
Item 4.4, Chair. One of my business partners has a family member who is a part owner of that building, but I've got no predetermination and I haven't been lobbied on that.
Thank you. Item 3, declaration to make representation as ward councillor. Does any member wish to make representation as a ward councillor or any of the items listed? No, thank you. He's on the list, isn't it? Yeah, that's fine. Item 4, development control and enforcement matters. Item 4.1 is the Sausage Northminster Peterborough PE11YN. Please can I ask Louise Simons to introduce the item?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The application before you seeks outline planning permission for the construction of a building comprising of up to 112 residential apartments and ground floor retail and restaurant units on the site of the Solstice, which has now been demolished. Thanks, Dan. This slide shows the application site, which is edged in red. The site is located within the City Core policy area of the city centre and at the junction of Brook Street and Northminster. The site comprises the now demolished Solstice nightclub and is located within a mixed-use area. To the north is Northminster House, a 4-storey office block. To the east, commercial units with the City College beyond, and to the south are leisure uses. The land to the west is awaiting redevelopment as part of the Northminster site, which members will be familiar with. This slide shows the planning policy context of the site. Whilst not within any designated conservation areas, the site is close to both the city centre and park conservation areas, which are shown here with brown lines with triangles on them. And situated some 290 metres to the southwest of the site is the Grade 1 listed Peterborough Cathedral. This slide shows you the context of the site in aerial form, and the site is edged there in red. Stanley Park is in the foreground with the site to just behind it. Key buildings have been highlighted for your information, with the former market, cathedral and City College noted. Turning to look at photographs of the site, this is the view looking north along Northminster. The former market and car park to the left-hand side, and the site to the right is indicated with blue hoardings. Bayard Place is noted there in the background. And here is the site in closer view, with Northminster House to the left-hand side and Brook Street to the right. Then panning round, this shows the context of the site looking southwards with the cathedral to the far right-hand corner. This also shows the appearance of the former Solstice building, which is no longer present. Turning to look at the proposal in more detail, the matters of site layout and scale are to be determined at this time. All other matters, those being access, appearance, landscaping, and the internal layout of the development, are reserved for later consideration. The proposal seeks a broadly U-shaped building of varying heights which would front onto Northminster and Brook Street. This is the submitted height parameters plan. The tallest section, which is shown in blue, would be 38.1 metres above ordnance datum, or 29.1 metres from ground level. This is the approximate height of a 10-storey building. The remaining development would be 18.15 metres above ordnance datum, or 9.15 metres from ground level. That's the burgundy purple colour. This shows an indicative ground floor layout which includes the mix of commercial uses and residential alongside the cycle and refuse storage for the residential flats. As I mentioned earlier, the internal layout is not proposed at this time and would be considered at reserve matters stage if outline permission was granted. However, the floor plans have been submitted to demonstrate that the amount of development proposed can be acceptably accommodated on the site. This is the illustrative floor plan for the first and second floors, and here the third to eighth floors, and finally the ninth floor. The indicative layout demonstrates accommodation with sufficient internal room sizes and adequate daylight and privacy. Officers are therefore content that the amount of development proposed could be accommodated within the parameters that have been sought. Notwithstanding this, the proposal is for up to 112 apartments, therefore allowing flexibility. The current proposal follows outline planning permission, which was granted less than a year ago for similar, albeit slightly smaller, development by members of this committee. The previous permission was for a similar footprint but a lower height and allowed for the construction of up to 56 residential apartments and 77 student units. The scheme has removed the student accommodation as the university operating model is such that student accommodation will not be required. In addition, the height of the building has now been increased in response to the outline planning permission granted on the former market site. This slide shows the difference between the approved and proposed schemes in terms of their height parameters. The blue section would see an increase in height of some 5.4 metres, or in layman's terms, 2 storeys, and the purple coloured sections would remain the same height as previously approved. The form would slightly change with the creation of the U-shape. This slide shows indicative proposed elevations of the development. However, it's important to note that these hold no weight in the determination of this application because appearance has been reserved for a later consideration. And again, whilst not of relevance to this application, it's useful for members to see the context. This CGI is a visual of what the development could look like when viewed from Northminster. And this looking south along Northminster. And this looking west along Brook Street. The market redevelopment site would be just beyond the development in the background, and you could probably just make out the former green roof of the market in the photograph. And this slide shows the indicative view of the development looking from Stanley Park, looking towards the cathedral. So turning now to look at the material planning considerations. In terms of the principle of development, officers consider that this is acceptable. The site lies within an allocation seeking a range of uses, and the extant outline planning permission is a material consideration. Officers see no reason to alter the view reached in granting that previous outline permission in terms of principle. In terms of design, members will be aware that the site is particularly sensitive in terms of heritage impact, given the proximity to the cathedral and conservation areas. Historic England has raised an objection to the scheme, and they are a statutory consultee. However, their comments relate to the original plans which were submitted and have now been changed to reflect the design that you see in front of you. Historic England were consulted on the revised plans on the 16th of June and have therefore had in excess of 28 days to comment. However, they have not submitted any comments, nor have they asked for an extension of time. As is set out in the update report, the National Planning Practice Guidance is clear that the local planning authority may continue to determine the application in the absence of any further comments from them. In addition to the objection from Historic England, the Council's Conservation Officer and Peterborough Civic Society, who will be speaking later, have also raised objections. Their main concerns relate to the bulk mass of the development and its impact on cathedral views, albeit the Civic Society have raised other concerns. This area of the city, as members will know, is undergoing extensive redevelopment and regeneration, and there is therefore a clear need to ensure that it is planned correctly and respectfully. Accordingly, we have sought the views of the same urban designer at Milton Keynes who provided comments on the Market redevelopment, the Northminster scheme. This slide shows the visual of how the current proposal could sit alongside the Northminster scheme and the existing building of Bayard Place. The urban designer has raised no objections to the overall parameters of the scheme, given the context of the site and the height of the Northminster redevelopment. Officers concur with the view that the increased height of the current proposal would correspond to the adjacent development sensitively. It would be marginally taller by 200 millimetres than the Northminster scheme. That's at submitted reserve matters stage, but this would be, in our view, imperceptible, and the proposed parameters will follow those of the outline permission of the Northminster scheme. However, it should be noted that the urban designer has raised concern with regards to the indicative visuals and the elevational treatment submitted, but that will be for future consideration, and we would expect the applicant or the subsequent developer to ensure that those comments were taken into account. Turning to heritage, that is the main crux of the consideration today, in our opinion. The extant permission for the site is a material consideration, and as it could reasonably be built out tomorrow, is a legitimate fallback position. Therefore, the main crux of the decision today is what is the additional impact above and beyond that extant planning permission? And does that worsen the impact upon the designated heritage assets? The key view of the cathedral in relation to this site is across Stanley Park, and this shows one of the best examples. And this another. And this demonstrates that the view is dynamic and ever-changing as you walk through Stanley Park. Detailed analysis of the various viewpoints through Stanley Park has been undertaken, and 5 of those will be shown to you now. Each will show the scheme as currently proposed and the 2020 planning permission, as well as the point of the viewpoint. The Northminster scheme has been shown by the applicant for context based on the outline parameter plans and not the reserve matters submission that's currently pending consideration. This visual shows the viewpoint, and the revised proposal in our view would be no worse than the impact of the extant permission. This viewpoint too, again, in our view, shows no additional impact from between the current proposal and the previous, with the loss of the transept resulting from the Northminster scheme, not this development. Again, we don't consider that this has any additional impact. This slide does show that some further loss of views of the cathedral would result, however not to a degree whereby the setting or significance is worsened in the view of officers. And finally, this slide in our view shows no difference in impact. On the basis of the assessment submitted, officers are of the view that there would be comparatively little to no difference or additional impact over and above the earlier approved scheme, particularly in the context of the approved height and scale parameters of the Northminster redevelopment, and the views to the cathedral would remain available from Stanley Park. As such, whilst we accept and acknowledge that the proposal would result in harm to the setting of the heritage asset, this harm would not be substantially worse, such that members found it acceptable last time and in our view should find it acceptable again this time. Therefore, in our opinion, there are no strong grounds to resist the current proposal on heritage or design matters. Oh, sorry, Dan. Go back for me. Turning to the other material planning considerations, I'll just provide a brief summary for you. There have been no objections raised from other statutory or technical consultees. The matter of access is reserved for later consideration. However, no parking is proposed and none is required given the site's location within the City Core policy area. The relationship of the proposal to surrounding development is such that the residential scheme would not cause harm to the amenity of neighbouring occupiers, and future occupiers would be subject to adequate privacy. The submitted layouts indicate that adequate amenity could be afforded to occupiers with the number of units proposed, and whilst no on-site public open space is proposed, this is in line with the scheme already granted permission, and a financial contribution would be secured towards improvements to Stanley Park and Burton Street allotments in lieu of that. Matters of drainage, contamination and archaeology are all found acceptable. Finally is the matter of infrastructure contributions. As members will be aware, Policy LP8 of the local plan seeks a 30% affordable housing provision on sites of 15 residential units or more. This would apply to the proposal. The applicant, however, has submitted a viability appraisal which demonstrates that the scheme cannot viably provide any affordable housing based on current build costs and the current forecast gross development value of the scheme. This has been reviewed in detail by the Council's Planning Obligations Officer and the appointed case officer, and the viability assessment is found to be sound. Therefore, officers are not seeking any contribution in terms of affordable housing. However, officers are aware that the market is ever changing, and therefore we do propose that a legal agreement secures a post-completion viability review with a clawback that, should the return for the developer improve from the forecast, we would seek financial contribution towards off-site affordable housing. Taking all of that into account, officers are of the view that the proposal is acceptable, and therefore our recommendation to you today is one of approval, subject to the conditions set out in the main committee report and the securing of a Section 106 legal agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We have 4 people registered to speak on this item. Please can I ask David Turnock to address the committee? You will have 5 minutes in which to address the committee. The Democratic Service Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left, and then when the 5 minutes have lapsed. When you are ready, if you can, please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee, for this opportunity to speak to you again today. I think probably today we're representing the views of your Conservation Officer, your Urban Design Consultant, and Historic England, who obviously haven't, as Louise Simmons has said, responded to the latest application, but I do understand they have a very heavy caseload, so I think they are all objecting to this proposal. The reason is simple, really. It's all about height. I think the revised plans that the applicant has submitted to remove part of the block along the north side of the site certainly give that separation from Northminster House and reduce the overall bulk of the building. But this building will be bulkier and taller than the application that you approved last year. Obviously, there's 2 extra floors. And perhaps I can ask Louise Simmons just to check the figures that she relayed in her presentation, because by my calculations, I think this building will be about 2.5 metres lower than the Northminster scheme, but maybe you can do that while I'm talking, Louise. I think it's sensible that this building is lower than the Northminster scheme. We have been working with the designers for that Northminster scheme, and they have encouragingly managed to reduce the height of that building. So I think they've taken about 1.5 metres off the total height. And you will recall, during that application process, we asked them to analyse all the views from around the city to ensure that the Northminster scheme didn't loom above the cathedral, particularly from the south. So if this application before you for the solstice sits down below the height of the Northminster scheme, I think it will work on that basis. But the design here is just one that is taller and bulkier. I think the relevant dimensions are that on the Brook Street side, it's about 4 metres longer on plan, and on the other northwest side, it's about 7 metres longer on plan. So the 10-storey tower will actually be bulkier than the scheme that you approved last year. We've seen the views, obviously, from Stanley Park, and it's all good credit to this council that Stanley Park has been upgraded, and it is now a far nicer place to be, and therefore the views that we are analysing and talking about from Stanley Park are probably even more valuable than they were when you actually gave permission to the previous scheme last year. It is becoming a more attractive place to stay and spend some time. I think the viewpoints that Louise Simmons showed, I think there were 5 of them, probably on views 2, 4 and 5, the 10-storey block does impinge more on that view of the cathedral. Yes, it doesn't block the cathedral, but a 10-storey building rather than an 8-storey building is going to loom more in your sight line when you look across Stanley Park and view towards the cathedral. So I think, as with many applications, the devil will be in the detail with this, and it's how the look and the aspect of the building will be detailed. And obviously that's not before you today. The external appearance and materials will come separately as a reserved matters application. But if you are minded to grant consent today, then perhaps one of the conditions that is listed in your report should also include roof terraces, because mention is made within there of the potential to create a roof terrace at third floor level for the use of occupiers and occupants. And that could well be a very good place for those residents to get the views of the cathedral that we all like and appreciate. That would be very similar to what has happened on the Northminster scheme, where the terraced essence of that scheme has allowed terraces and open areas to be created viewing back towards the cathedral. So I think those are my concern, or our concerns of the Civic Society. It's all about height, and obviously the potential that in future you might well get applications from adjoining sites for similarly 10-storey high developments, and that's exactly what we don't want on the north side of the city. We do appreciate that the applicant in this instance has tried to be as deferential as possible to the view of the cathedral, but we do think the 10-storey bulk of the building still impinges more than an 8-storey building that you permitted last year. Thank you, Chair. I'm done, unless Louise Simmons wants to just clarify items on those dimensions for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Depends where you take the measurements from. So, based on the Reserve Matters application that is currently pending for the Northminster scheme, scaling from the elevations from floor level to the top of the highest part of the building is 31.2 metres. And the proposal, the parameters plan, seeks 29.1 metres, which is where the 200 mil has come from in my calculations in the presentation given. Does that clarify? Mil. Yes, you are correct. Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Do any members of the committee wish to ask a question? Councillor Hogg?
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Sorry, so just to clarify that, so the Northminster scheme is currently at 31.2 metres, but you said that that the developers have now been encouraged to reduce that. What have they reduced that to?
If you look in your report, the figure that your officers have put in is a building height of 33.3 metres for Northminster.
Oh, okay.
And Louise has just confirmed that that is actually only 31.2 metres. So
Yeah.
they have managed, in their detailed design, to strip out 2 metres from the height, which, as I alluded to, is going to be good because you will see less of that building from the more distant views, particularly to the south of the cathedral. So the fact that the Solstice scheme is now another 2 metres below the height of even the Reserve Matters application, which your officers are dealing with for Northminster, I think is a positive thing.
Okay.
Well, I suppose my response, Councillor, is that if you stuck to your 8-storey building that you gave permission for last year, it would sit far happier. But if you're minded to permit this 10-storey application, it will still sit down below the height of the Northminster scheme. And I think that's the key point.
Okay.
I think Louise wants to come in.
It's just in response to Councillor's question. So what's in the Keeping report is based on an lower, but that's still pending consideration. So we've based our assessment on what is confirmed, which is the granted plan for Northminster. But Mr. Turner is correct, the reserve matters for Northminster has come in lower, and this development is lower than that again.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Thank you. Please can I ask Councillor Fitzgerald to address the committee. You will have 5 minutes in which to address the committee. The Democratic Service Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left, and then when the 5 minutes have lapsed, when you are ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Second time on this application for me, so it's not new. I was here previously when I was Deputy Leader, and now I'm here again as Leader of the Council. I come, as I did last time, to support the economic growth of the city and the much need. There is much need for houses and homes in the city, as we know. And I'll start with a comment that David Turnock made. I don't prejudge or predetermine that there shouldn't be more 10-storey applications or 15-storey applications, and the planning committee should have the same mind, I would suspect. So individual people that want to come along and develop stuff in the city, we shouldn't determine what they do. It's up to us to determine their application, and they can be minded to do what they think is sensible. However, the same objections that I hear today are the same objections that I heard last time, which the committee obviously, I believe, made the right decision. I'm sure you will again today, because the recommendation for this application is for approval. And it is below what has already been set as a precedence with Northminster still. And the views or all the historic concerns and cultural concerns are minimal in terms of the scale and impact that they have. It will not make a great deal of difference. And the applicants have, as I understand it, already scaled back their plans in order to be compliant and also to be doing the right thing and trying to fit in with the surrounds. So I can't see any reason why the committee should not take a decision based on the officer's recommendations. The world has changed again since this application first came before the committee. We've had COVID, we've had the ARU university come along now, that wasn't known before. So what the developers were hoping to do at the time perhaps is now not the same. So therefore they've had to adjust their plans accordingly. Also, in terms of maximising the development, because you've heard about the viability issues, that it may just not be viable if it was less either. And I think there's been some caveat put in terms of a condition of clawback if there is some Section 106 required for the provision of housing off-site or a contribution to it. So, and I think that's a very sensible and positive thing to do. So I think that the 8-storey Solstice scheme, since that was approved, the committee has approved 10 stories, I said just a moment ago. So it's perhaps not unreasonable for the owners and developers to think that the scheme marginally below the height of the Northminster should be acceptable. And I think I heard Louise outline all the reasons why that is. And the Civic Society and others, Historic England and our conservation people, have a right to be concerned because they are the custodians and guardians of the city's heritage and culture, and that is only proper and right. But it shouldn't be the only factor and override everything else. Quite often we obsess in the city about height, and I've said so before, to the detriment or the holding back of development in the city. And we're not that big a place. If we can't go out, we've got to go up. So everybody knows our housing crisis. Everybody knows about the pressure on the housing stock and the private sector, and both socially rented. Again, the Northminster scheme will be 80% market rent, of course, which is great. And all this accommodation, when put side by side, will only complement and add to the available number of properties, giving much needed homes to people. But indeed, the cathedral and its views are important. So I don't think, just as I said last time, that this has any denigration of those views or makes our city's skyline or outline worse. I think you heard me say we wouldn't have built the Shard if we in London if we took account of every single historical building nearby. And I also said before, the best view of the cathedral is go and stand in front of it. They'll love you for it much better, and while you're there, put money in the box. I had the same conversation with the Dean, and he probably tended to agree with me. So I think probably, Chair, I'm not going to take too much more of the committee's time. I must be more or less there. But it's interesting that there are no objections to this scheme on the whole, but there is a lot of support for the scheme, I also noted. So I will say to you, I hope that you can agree with the applicant's principles and motives behind this, and they are doing what they think is the right thing. And I wouldn't take any account of the building because that's a subjective issue. I heard it be called
Your time's up.
Uninspiring. I'm done.
Your sum up, please.
I'm done, Chair. I just, the design and everything else will come forward at a later date. But thank you for your time this afternoon, committee, and I strongly urge you to accept officer recommendation.
Thank you. Do any members of committee wish to ask any questions? Councillor Hogg.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Councillor Fitzgerald, you say that you come before us as the leader of the council, and you're wanting to boost the economic side of things. This application has no provision for affordable rent, and as you say that in fact you mentioned it. You mentioned briefly that we are in a situation where we are desperate for more affordable rent. So how do you square this scheme with the fact that it is unable to provide any of that affordable rent?
Any scheme cannot provide everything for everyone. So if it's a question of do we build these apartments for people, and then there may be a churn in the market with people moving into them, freeing up other homes elsewhere in the city, but it grows the overall pot of availability of houses or homes for people. Now, in terms of, I don't set the rules. The council has policy on what it does about affordable housing, and I've heard Louise say that there is provision to take money for affordable housing in a post viability option within the conditions. So I'm perfectly happy with that. We do it for everyone else. Why wouldn't we do it for this scheme if that's what officers have determined? So it's the officers that determine whether or not it is viable or not in terms of an open book policy. And if they've said it's not, I would still rather have the houses or apartments, Councillor Hogg, than have no development, because we are adding to the total stock of housing, whatever tenure it is, it can only be a good thing, and it makes or gives opportunities for people to move into ownership. I don't know what the tenure will be personally, whether they're going to be for sale or for rent. That's not for me to determine. But we need more housing stock wherever it comes from, and that's why I'm here, because we need to push the economic growth of the city and the regeneration of the city, and this is another one of those projects that will be of benefit to that area.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Now, can I please ask Simon Machen and Jeremy Good to address the committee? You will have 5 minutes between you in which to address the committee. The Democratic Services Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left and then when the 5 minutes have lapsed. When you are ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. The applicant is a subsidiary company of MPB Structures, a company founded locally by Michael Boyle, a long-time resident of Peterborough. MPB work across the UK on major development projects and are one of the main contractors on the first phase of the new Peterborough University, so they have a very local interest in the city. Planning consent was granted unanimously by this committee in February last year for a development comprising 56 apartments and 77 student rooms. That application was prepared before the COVID-19 pandemic, the subsequent rise in labour and materials costs, before the announcement of the new university operator ARU, and before the approval of the Northminster scheme. These significant changes have meant that my clients have had to revisit the commerciality of their scheme. In particular, they engaged directly with ARU regarding their accommodation requirements, and their representative, Mr. Harris, confirmed that given the university operating model, ARU did not see a need for purpose-built accommodation and would not be entering into nomination agreements with accommodation provided. Without this certainty, the development of a purpose-built university accommodation block presents too great a commercial risk. I'd like to thank Louise Simmons for the report before you. It recommends that the application should be approved. It's a very thorough report that assesses in detail all of the relevant planning issues. Importantly, there are no objections from technical consultees to the application beyond the heritage representations referred to earlier. The officer report states that the proposal represents an appropriate mix of uses for a disused but sustainably located city centre site and would enhance the vitality and viability of this part of the city centre. On the issue of design and layout, it concludes that whilst there are not many examples of tall buildings in the city centre, the increased massing compared to the extant outline permission is considered to be appropriate. It further states that the proposal would not appear unduly dominant or obtrusive within the locality and would respect the overall form and appearance of the area, particularly the emerging context of the Northminster scheme. We fully endorse the professional officer assessment, Chairman. On heritage, the objections received from consultees are disappointing but not unexpected. Similar objections were received to the previous scheme, which the committee unanimously approved, seeing the clear regeneration benefits for Northminster and the city centre. Most importantly, your professional planning officers recommend approval, concluding that there are no material grounds, including those of policy, on which a different conclusion could be reached. Whilst I respect the views of the civic society, I would say that we wouldn't be sat here today in this building if their objection to the Fletton Quays outline planning application had won the day. I think we can all see the benefits of regeneration in the city. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Oh, Gary, I've got a couple of minutes left. Thank you. It was working, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's working now.
Thank you. Thank you, members. Just very briefly, I'm here to answer questions, really, in relation to the viability issues, but if I could maybe just take on Councillor Hogg's question in relation to the affordability. I suppose there's 2 points I wanted to make. One being that clearly you've got Northminster next door, which is delivering discounted rent. So that's a kind of affordable tenure that's going to be right on the doorstep of the scheme. But I suppose the one I'm here to address really is in relation to the viability, and the scheme is marginally viable. It's MPPF talks about delivering at least between 15 and 20% of a GDV, which is where we've managed to get to. If you impose an affordable housing requirement based on the current market conditions, that falls way below the level that would deliver a sustainable development, and hence the discussions that we've had with your advisor, Mr. Freeman. Another quick point, just on the Northminster scheme. I was actually agent for that, so I can talk about that one in as much detail as you like, but we're not here for that. But on the original outline, there was contingency built into the parameters plans, as there would be with any sort of outline applications, if you like. Hence the reduction that's happened. And I can confirm that what we've now got to is a scheme that is at least 2 metres lower than that Northminster scheme as it's been delivered through the reserve matters.
Thank you. Do any members of the committee wish to ask questions? Councillor Hogg.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. So what I'm trying to get my head around is, as you rightly say, across the road, 80% of that development is reduced rent. And yet this development, not 1% of affordable housing can be found. I'm just trying to work out why 2 buildings so close together in exactly the same location, why it is that suddenly the figures don't add up for your building, whereas they do for other buildings, and I just feel like, maybe there's been a contrived situation, and I'm mindful of the fact that our local plan states quite clearly that we're looking for a provision of 30%, and I feel that it kind of goes against, what we're trying to achieve as a city, in order to get housing for those people that need it.
Thank you.
If I may give a very simple answer to that question, this application isn't subject to £14 million worth of combined authority grant to deliver affordable housing, which the Northminster scheme is. So it's a publicly subsidised scheme at Northminster. This is a private development scheme, so there's no grant going into it from anywhere. So you can imagine what difference £14 million makes to being able to deliver affordable housing. So there is no such grant available for this project.
Any more questions? Councillor Hiller.
It's not so much a question, just a point of clarification as to what Councillor Hogg was saying. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that the Northminster scheme was 80% affordable housing. No, it's all 80%. It's affordable rent. The whole of the development, every single one of those units, is 80% less than the market rent. So it's not a percentage of the total, if that makes sense. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that, Councillor Hiller. Any more questions? Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. Just going back to the GDV figure that you quoted, I presume that's based on current market construction costs and so forth. So I just wondered what your projected view would be should things like the steel market come back as they're beginning to, and so on, and what that GDV value might go to, and whether that releases a possibility for moving back to affordable housing.
Okay, so obviously you have the safeguard built into the scheme as it stands at the moment, which is the reappraisal once the scheme's actually delivered. But with any viability appraisal, it can only be a snapshot in time. We've used BCIS figures, which is industry standard, based on current build costs and also projected build costs. We've done 4 or 5 viability appraisals now. Obviously the scheme was tweaked during the course of the application, but even looking at when the construction period might start, because BCIS actually predicts ahead a certain number of quarters, as you're probably aware, so that we're actually below BCIS figures at the moment. That's also been cross-checked with a company called Edge, who are the QSs that advise our clients, and they've confirmed based on tender prices that our figures are actually marginally down from what they would normally expect. So let's hope that the construction industry does sort itself out and then things get better in terms of build costs, but I think for the foreseeable future that's unlikely, which is why we need flexibility on schemes like this if you want to see them delivered.
Any more questions? Thank you. You may now return to your seats in the public gallery. Now, any questions for officers? Councillor Hiller.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A question for Louise. Can you just clarify in layman's terms how you are going to approach this viability aspect on the affordable housing? I think Councillor Hogg's raised some very salient points about the affordable housing element to this scheme. So could you just perhaps outline what you propose to do before any of these properties is occupied? So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, thank you, Councillor Hiller. What would happen is once the development has been completed and the values established, there would be a post-development viability appraisal done, exactly the same as has been done for the application, an open book appraisal that would be assessed by the Council's Section 106 officer. If there is an uplift in the value and the returns from the development such that a contribution could have been provided, we will secure that contribution and put it towards off-site affordable housing provision that would be spent with our strategic housing team.
Very interesting question. If there are no more questions, I will move to debate before we start the debate, oh, sorry, Councillor Hogg, sorry, I missed you.
Sorry.
How could I miss you today?
Can you just clarify why the PCC strategic housing put no objection, but then go on to talk about the numbers of social housing that would be required? How does that figure? I don't quite understand how they can have no objection and then go into, saying that there should be 34 units, 24 of which should be affordable rent and 10 intermediate tenure.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. When the strategic housing team comment, they look at what policy LP8 says and they calculate for us how much of an affordable housing proportion is required and what split that should be. They don't know at the time that they make those comments that there is no viability, or the viability shows that no affordable housing could be provided. That then is for officers to make that assessment and whether it accords with policy LP8. Obviously, as you pointed out, there is no affordable housing, so the proposal is contrary to policy LP8, but they have adequately shown viability. And the question before members is, can you live with no affordable housing, or can you live with no development taking place? And that's where we're at.
Thank you. Any more questions? Right now, before we start the debate, I think I would like to ask Louise to just give us a breakdown what issues that we should be considering for effective debate, please.
So the Chair has asked officers before each debate to provide a list of the material planning considerations relevant to the proposal to direct the debate. So this is set out in section 5 of the committee report. So the main planning considerations in the view of officers are the principle of development, heritage, design and layout, access, parking and highway implications, fire risk, neighbour amenity, future occupier amenity, contamination, drainage, archaeology and infrastructure contributions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Who would like to start the debate? Councillor Hiller.
Can I just be cheeky and ask officers a question?
Yes, you
before
can.
The debate. That's very kind of you, Chair. You outlined the areas that we are to be particularly concerned, and I thank you, Chair, for directing our officers to do that. But parking is always a little bit contentious. I remember the Northminster site when the outline came before committee. There was much discussion around the parking. Could you just clarify the parking policy for city centre? I note the Civic Society were objecting about the lack of parking being provided, but could you just outline the policy stance on that, please?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Within the City Core Policy Area, which is where the application site is located, the local plan seeks no new parking unless there are exceptional reasons for doing so. So in the view of officers, there is no requirement for parking for this development.
Thank you. Thank you. Who's going to start the debate? Councillor Hiller?
Yes, I'm happy to, Chair. I've looked at this very closely, both from the original application point of view as a committee member, and this latest application that's come before the committee. And I think there's a couple of points I sort of pulled out of people's addresses, both for and against. In particular, Mr. Thornl. To my mind, I think the relevant phrase is comparatively, or certainly very little additional impact from the extant consent. That's the extant consent means that what they can build tomorrow if they want to. So I think my particular concern was the affordable housing element, and I think Councillor Hogg was quite right in asking some pretty searching questions about that. I've been reassured from Louise that will be addressed at the time of the completion of this development. I would urge the committee to be very stringent in ensuring that does happen at the time, Chair. I think that's really very important, because affordable housing, Councillor Fitzgerald made the very relevant point that we are very keen to encourage development both in and around our city, but particularly in the city centre, in this particular area, the Northminster area generally, if there is no provision other than what we've got already with the 80% affordable rent, if there is no provision for the 30% criteria that we have, at this juncture, I would want to make sure that that viability is assessed at a later date. I think that's really, really important. And that goes to a great degree to assuage my concerns about that. So on the basis of that, Chair, I will be supporting this application. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hussain.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what Councillor Hill has just said. Listening to the comments that have been made and reading through the report, you know, I'm sitting here looking at the cathedral, and as much as, you know, growing up in the city, we do like the views of the cathedral, and it is, you know, central to the city. But I'm happy to see and hear that the extra 2 floors do not impinge on that view. They don't affect it in any way. You know, the adjoining buildings we also have to consider. I know we talk a lot about the cathedral and heritage, you know, in this committee, but at the same time, I think we have to consider when we're looking at developments that they do correlate with each other, that when people come into the city, they're not always looking at the cathedral or will always be able to see the cathedral, but what they do see does sit well within the city and with the surrounding buildings. And I think that this building will complement the Northminster proposals. It's a similar sort of height, a bit lower, which is good. So yeah, I'm minded to vote in favour of this and agree with officers.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Hogg.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. So I think that there's certainly a lot to merit this this development. I think they've done a lot of work in terms of making sure that what views of the cathedral that still exist are protected, and they've obviously made changes to their scheme in conjunction with our planning officers, and you know that's how it should be. I'm not particularly concerned about the height. I think they've come forward with a reasonable suggestion, which, you know, I kind of, when we approved the Northminster site, I did think to myself that, you know, there was a possibility that that this might come back to us, because at the time it was kind of pushing the limits, and then the Northminster site kind of pushed the limits a bit further, and there's almost a kind of a race to the top, as it were. But you know, I'm okay with that. What I am concerned about, as I'm sure it won't surprise you, is this issue with affordable housing. I'm not just for this application, but for other applications coming forward. I think that if we send out the message that actually our policy for 30% is open for negotiation, from 30% down to 0%, I think it's going to send out much in the same way that the message of approving the Northminster site much higher than this has come back, because they've gone, oh well, if they can go higher, we can go higher. So it could well be that, you know, we get a raft of applications where suddenly this kind of figure of 30% for affordable housing is suddenly becoming more of a pipe dream rather than the reality. You know, we set that level for a reason. There was a lot of hard work that went into our local plan, and you know, the 30% wasn't just plucked out the air. It was, you know, thought long and hard as to what that figure should be, and I think that this application coming before us with 0% on affordable housing, it does worry me, and I'm not sure that I can really support the application on that basis. I take on board that there's this kind of clawback clause. But for me, it's not just about this site; it's about other sites going forward. And I think this is something that we need to draw a line in the sand on.
Thank you, Councillor Hogg. Anybody else? You want to come back, Councillor Hussain? Yep, go ahead.
Initially, yeah, I would have said, the social housing aspect was a concern, but I think officers have addressed it. I think Councillor Fitzgerald made a valid comment when he said that you build houses and then you free up more houses down the line, and it's a way of people moving up. So to a newer or bigger house. So that would help that side of it, where you are freeing up more affordable housing. I think we have to put trust in our officers that they will do the post-completion viability review to make sure that if it is there is money there to be taken for social housing, they will do that. We have to also consider current times, the situation. We're asking a developer to build a 10-storey building in the city centre with a little bit of uncertainty in the market at the moment, as in what's going to happen in 6 months or a year's time. They could build this building and be at a loss. So it's the right way to go about it, to ensure, one, that they build it, and then we can look at that time at the market and see whether it's viable or whether they have made a loss or not. There's material costs are going up, energy costs, everyone knows, are going up, labour costs are going up. So I think it's right to say to them, build it, and then we'll see at the end where we are and, what we can do.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, I'll have to say something about it as well. The way I look at it, I only see there are two issues. One is the height, and one is the affordable housing. And I think Councillor Hiller asked a very relevant question to Louise, and she addressed it appropriately. You've got a clause there, and in your questioning and your debate, I give full value what you've raised. It's a very important issue. There's a purpose of having 30% there, but then we've got a mechanism around it where we could, ask them to. There's a way around it to have a clause in place where we could hold them to account. So I think we will have full trust in our officers. They've given us an alternative which will compensate to a certain extent. On that basis, I had an issue with affordable housing. I think that's been addressed. So I will be supporting the officer's recommendation. Any more debate before we go to the proposal? Right, do we have a proposal then? Councillor Hussain.
I propose that we go with officer's recommendation and as it is.
Okay. Do you have a seconder? Let's go for Councillor Sharp. If you don't mind. Right. All in favour of the recommendation? Against? Any abstentions? So, application has been approved. Thank you very much. Right. Where are we now? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to give a figure? You gave a figure, isn't it? Okay, that's fine. Oh, there's another script here, which I thought, right. Got carried away. Okay, should we go to item number 2? Right, can we start on item number 4.2, 16 Russell Hill. Please can I ask Louise Simons to introduce the item? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The second application before you today seeks retrospective planning permission for the change of use of a parcel of agricultural land to extend the residential garden of 16 Russell Hill in Thornl. and the construction of a children's play equipment area. This slide shows the application site edged in red to the western side of the village. The land that is subject to the change of use is located to the west of the dwelling, known as 16 Russell Hill. And this slide shows the planning policy context of the application site. As you will see, the host dwelling is located within the identified settlement envelope of Thornl, which is identified in the blue with the blue line, and also within the Thornl conservation area, which is shown with the yellow line, and the arrows show where the conservation area extends to. The land subject to the change of use and the play equipment is located outside the settlement boundary and is therefore in policy terms within the open countryside. The site is sensitive in terms of heritage context, with several listed buildings within the locality identified in orange. And this slide shows an aerial photograph of the site before the change of use took place. Running to the west of the dwelling is a mature hedgerow, and the land that is subject to the change of use sits beyond that to the left-hand side. Part of the hedgerow has been removed to punch through between the application site and the host dwelling to allow connection between the dwelling and the extended garden. The land is roughly rectangular in shape and measures 17.6 metres in width and 44.8 metres in maximum length. This area is roughly 730 square metres. Turning to look at the site and the photographs in more detail, this shows the vehicular access to the application site looking westwards out of the village. The land subject to the change of use is at the far left-hand side. And this looking eastward with the application site to the end of the access that is shown. This shows the garden land beyond the gate in front of you. The mature hedge that you can see is the historic boundary of the village and the conservation area, and separates the land that has been changed use from the existing residential curtilage. Here is the land subject to the application in more detail. It has been planted with trees, albeit these were not shown on the submitted plans, and this also shows the children's play equipment. And here the play equipment in more detail. This is operational development because it results in a raised platform more than 300 mil above floor level, so planning permission is needed. And this photograph shows the relationship of the original garden, which was where the photograph is taken from, out towards the land subject to the application, and where the trampoline is the section of hedgerow that has been removed. So this slide shows the historic map of the village from 1900, and it clearly shows a defined settlement boundary to the western edge of the village. And again, in 1967, the host dwelling is just to the south of where you can see Thornl, with the land subject to the change of use beyond that edge. And this aerial photograph from 1997 again shows the clearly defined village boundary on the western side of Thornl. The Parish Council of Thornl has objected to the application owing to its position outside the settlement boundary. As members will be aware, policy LP2 of the local plan sets out the spatial strategy for development within the city. Within the open countryside, outside settlement boundaries, the policy is unequivocal that development can only be accepted in specified circumstances. The proposal meets none of these. The policy then goes on to state that all other residential development will, by definition, be contrary to the local plan. In light of this, officers consider that the principle of development is wholly unacceptable. As you'll be aware, the local plan is the starting point in considering applications, unless there are material considerations that indicate otherwise. The applicant and Councillor Elsie, who is supportive of the application, considers that there are such considerations. The applicant has advised that the development took place to support their dependent son, who has special medical needs, and these needs outweigh the harm from departing from the local plan. An education, health and care assessment has been provided, and members have been presented this as an exempt annex to the main committee report. In addition, the dependent school has provided a letter detailing the benefit that the development provides to the son, and this was included as an exempt appendix to the update report. Whilst officers are wholly sympathetic to the applicant's needs and desires to provide a better quality of life for their son, we don't feel that the sufficient justification has been provided for the sheer size and scale of the encroachment into the open countryside and the departure to this extent from the local plan. In addition to the concerns regarding the principle of development, officers also have concerns with regards to the impact upon the character of the area. This is supported by objections from both the Council's conservation and tree officers. As has been evidenced in preceding slides, the western village boundary is historic and has been in place for over 100 years. The mature hedgerow formed this historic boundary, and any loss results in considerable harm to the historic setting of both the village and the conservation area. Encroachment into the countryside of this scale, and with the associated structure, blurs the line between built form and countryside, which planning seeks to control. The development appears a stark and obvious encroachment and detracts from the setting of Thornl and its conservation area. This is further exacerbated by the unnecessary residential clutter, which is visually inappropriate and at odds. In NPPF terms, the harm to designated heritage assets is less than substantial, but that's not to say that it's not considerable. The NPPF requires us to then balance the harm against the public benefits. Whilst we acknowledge that there would be clear benefit to the applicant and their son, this is not a public benefit. Therefore, the weight of the harm is greatest, and policy directs that planning permission should be refused. Therefore, taking this and all of the other considerations into account, we're of the view that the proposal is unacceptable and wholly contrary to the development plan. There are no material planning considerations to indicate otherwise, and therefore our recommendation to you today is one of refusal for the specific reasons set out in the main committee report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 3 people registered to speak on this item. Please can I ask Councillor Elsie, Ward Councillor, to address the committee. You will have 10 minutes in which to address the committee. The Democratic Service Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left and when the 10 minutes have lapsed. When you're ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm hoping that this won't take anywhere near 10 minutes. I'm speaking in support of this application because it's the right thing to do. Our officers have gone into great detail about how this spoils the landscape, how it should be resisted because it's residential development outside the curtilage of the village, and how it doesn't fall into their 3 black and white exemptions. The reality is that from the paperwork I've seen, excepting 2 objections from the Parish Council, who I normally support, but are essentially people who have moved into the village in the last 25 years, there has only been 1 other objection. Do you not think that if this garden, because that's what it is, not a residential development, was that much of a concern, more people within the village would object? Louise's slide 1 conveniently blocked out the fact that as you approach the village from that road, there's a huge farmyard on the left-hand side, and to suggest that a small garden is detrimental to the view and the approach to the village when you've got a huge industrial farmyard on one side of it is a moot point in my opinion. The Sharpley family have farmed the land and owned much of the property within Thornl for generations, maintaining grass verges, shrubland, hedgerows and open farmland for the good of the whole village. They have simply extended their garden on one property from land which they own and farm, to make the life of their son and grandson better for his life ahead. Freddie Sharpley, with the challenges he has, deserves this opportunity. The Sharpley family has been treated poorly from the start of this process at the hands of officers, who are obviously against this garden. One being so rude to the Sharpleys, he is no longer employed by the council. I accept that in planning terms, things appear and officers' decisions are based on black and white, but life isn't. If the Sharpleys are ordered to remove this garden and the land it sits on, being theirs, decide to leave it to go to ruin, it will have a far bigger impact on the view and the entrance to the village than a play area, which can barely be seen, is well maintained and is shielded by hedging, which is growing rapidly day by day. I would like to introduce the following facts to support this. The application site is located just outside the conservation area. It's very difficult to see how it could harm the setting or character of the conservation area, given it is set well back from the Russell Hill frontage and has boundary hedging. The Conservation Officer appears to have an issue with the position and appearance of the existing houses built in 2007 and the access road to them. However, they already exist. The Sharpleys, as previously stated, are a farming family, have a long history in the village, and 16 Russell Hill was built by them for their family. Thornl is a picturesque village set in countryside, but we need to remember it's also a working village, not a museum. Again, as previously stated, the surrounding countryside is managed by people like the Sharpleys, the local farming community. They maintain the hedges, the ditches, and produce our food. It's essential that we support them. This is a planning application about a child who needs a safe and secure place to play because of his personal circumstances. The family have provided information explaining these needs, which the committee have as exempt papers. I draw particular attention to the letter from Freddie's teacher, who sees this area as essential. I'm sure Mr. Sharpley would be very able to explain more about why this is needed in closed session, if necessary. The main planning objection from officers is its location outside the village boundary, that its development in the open countryside, that it is development in the open countryside and should be resisted. In reality, it's a small parcel of land next to a house surrounded by boundary hedging. Those who attended the site visit will know it's almost invisible from Russell Hill on the approach into the village. The committee can consider the personal needs of the applicant and weigh these against what your officers perceive to be harm to the open countryside. In this case, a very small part of a large arable field would be lost to create a large garden for a child born and raised in the village. I would again respectfully request that members note the advice of Mr. Sharpley's son's teacher about the importance of this play space and the harm that removing it could potentially cause. I ask this committee to look beyond the black and white and look at the colour. The colour is that the officers are asking you to remove an essential play area for a young boy who, through his SEND report and the narrative from his teacher, has demonstrated this area to be critical to his development. A play area which isn't impeding on anyone or anything other than his grandfather's own land. It would be a very dark day for Peterborough if we become the authority who cares more about an implied compromise of a country view than that of the needs of our youngsters with autism. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any members of committee wish to ask any questions? Councillor Hiller.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Councillor Elsey. Thank you for that address. I listened very closely to what you were saying, and I have to say I've a high degree of sympathy with the case that you put forward. You mentioned on a couple of occasions that this was a garden land or an extension of a garden land. It isn't. You'll be aware of that. It is open countryside, and we do have a very clear policy in the local plan. LP2 has been outlined by our case officer with regard to the regulations and the rules governing that. What you're asking, presumably, is, this is my question, is for the committee to look sympathetically at that case and put the needs of the applicant above the policy. Am I understanding that right?
Thank you, Councillor Miller. Yes, you are. The challenge I had there is that I referred to it as garden land because this is a retrospective application rather than a new application. I am aware that the land was arable farming land, but obviously this is a retrospective application, so at this moment in time it is now mown, grassed and well kept area. Thank you.
If I might, Chair, whatever it's being used for currently, it doesn't alter its status. It is actually countryside. You'll be. I know you know that. Another question for you. Are you aware as to why this this exercise facility, this recreational facility, couldn't actually be created within the curtilage of the property rather than going into the outside, into the open countryside?
My understanding from speaking with Mr. and Mrs. Sharpley and having had reference to the reports from his teacher and the SEND report is that Freddie's presentations are such that if he has an episode, he needs to be in a space which is not crowded, where he can go and escape on his own, but be safely monitored from a distance. And the impact on him of having other people around him, if he feels he needs to, for want of a better expression, escape to his own little place, has an even more detrimental effect on his presentation, and therefore it needs to be separated from where the rest of the family potentially have their garden space. It needs to be Freddie's space for him to be able to escape and feel on his own, even though he's not on his own because he's being monitored by Mr. and Mrs. Sharpley from their garden space.
So if I might just clarify, Chair. So by that separation, you're referring to this child being away from the main property, formal garden, and being thereafter protected by that physical removal. Yes, just a yes or no. Really.
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Simons.
Thank you, Councillor. So, yeah, was it formerly agricultural land or was it a paddock? Just out of interest.
It was formerly agricultural land. It was part of the field that's owned by the Sharpley family.
Any more questions? No? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Please can I ask Simon Merchant and Peter Sharpley to address the committee. You will have 5 minutes between you in which to address the committee. The Democratic Services Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left and when the 5 minutes have lapsed. When you are ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. As you've already heard from Councillor Elsey, there are important personal circumstances here which we feel should be weighed in the planning balance. The personal circumstances of the applicant are capable of being a material planning consideration in this instance. The officer report suggests that the proposal represents unwarranted and unjustified development in the open countryside and should be refused as a matter of principle. It states that the personal needs of the applicant do not outweigh this consideration, and I quote, that the need for this particular site and its scale has not been justified. It's unclear what your officers mean by referencing the need for this particular site. It's immediately next to 16 Russell Hill, my client's home, and it allows direct supervision, albeit from a distance, of their son. It simply couldn't be provided somewhere else. It has to be provided next to the house. You've got before you the SEND report and also a letter from the class teacher, and these very clearly explain the personal circumstances and the potential impact on health and well-being should the application be refused. Mr. Sharpley can explain in more detail in closed session if you require the personal circumstances involved. Your officers make reference in the report to a similar scheme in Thornl that was dismissed at appeal. However, what they fail to mention is that it related to White Hart Farm on English Drove, north of the A47, 2 kilometres from the village boundary. That is in no way comparable to the proposal here. 16 Russell Hill is located within the village and the application site is located immediately adjacent to the village boundary. Also, there were no material personal circumstances in the Thornl case. It's like comparing apples and London buses. The two have no similarity whatsoever. Turning to impact on character and appearance, the officer report suggests that there would be no significant harm to the setting. There would be significant harm to the setting of the conservation area. I made a point of driving out there again yesterday in my 4-wheel drive, which has got a fairly high seat in it, and the application site isn't visible until you get to the access to these properties. You simply can't see it in a distant view because of the height of the hedges going into the village and the buildings on your left as you drive out. It's not therefore visible within the context of the conservation area, because what you do if you stand at the entrance is you look south towards the countryside outside the conservation area, you don't look into the conservation area. It's behind you and to your left. Similarly, the proposal doesn't affect the setting of any listed buildings. From your site visit, you will have struggled to see any buildings other than the farm complex immediately opposite. So the site's technically just outside the village envelope, but the important question is whether the personal circumstances of the applicant can outweigh the loss of a small fragment of a large agricultural field farmed by my client. We believe they can and that they should. Planning conditions can be imposed to require additional hedge planting, to take away permitted development rights, and if necessary to restrict the consent on a personal level to my client, meaning that if the property is ever sold in the future, the site would have to revert back to agricultural use. But as you heard from Councillor Elsey, the Sharpleys have been in the village a very long time and are likely to remain in the village a very long time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. We've got a minute and a half left, if you could finish off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the committee. Apologies for my lateness earlier. Farming's quite busy at the moment. As you're aware, our son Freddie was diagnosed with autism 4 years ago, and it's been very challenging to meet his needs. We are fortunate that my wife doesn't have to work in order to focus on him and his newborn brother, who's just turned 1, and we're hoping they'll both be fifth-generation farmers in the village. Now, as Fred's life's progressed, we have learnt he needs to self-soothe and be in an environment that's safe and locked. He has got no concept of danger. We have to hold his hand in car parks, we have to take his hand if we cross a road, and he's 7. He can't walk to his granddad's house across the road to the farmyard. As farmers, we spend a lot of time outside, and I try to take Fred around the farm with me as I can in the farm truck, but farming is dangerous. Farming has big tractors. He will see a tractor and try to climb on it. So for his own safety, we leave him at home with his mum, and I go to work when I have to. A safe, secure site is paramount.
Just a reminder, 30 seconds left.
Okay, almost done. There are no playgrounds in the village, and since building the site, Freddie has come out of his shell more and gained other normalities which other non-SEN kids have as a daily rule. He wants to be free, he wants to run around, and as alluded to earlier, there was no space next to the house to build a site big enough to keep him busy. A swinging frame wouldn't be big enough, unfortunately. He bought it. It's got a short attention span. So, anyway, thank you much for your time, everyone.
Thank you. Does any member of the committee wish to ask a question? Councillor Heller.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Hello, Mr. Sharpley. Just picking up on what you said about a safe and secure site being paramount for your son. I noticed on the Friday site visit that it's bounded by a fairly open wooden fence. Do you consider that as a safe and secure site? Perhaps you'd like to expand on that.
If you'd seen the lock on the gates, it's locked with 4-figure padlock, so he should be struggling to go out of that. But the point is he's on the play area at the bottom, not at the top, where his mother can see him. But yes, the whole site is locked. And there's also a fence netting around the whole site, so it's dog-proof, but effectively child-proof. So he can't climb through it, he'd have to go over the top of it, time which would take him seconds or two. Well, seconds, so it'd take him long enough for a mother to go, right, you're coming out, you're going back in here.
Any more questions? Councillor Hogg.
Just a quick question. So the piece of land is quite large, and the sort of play equipment is down at one end. Can you just explain why you need quite so much of that land? Could it just be the bottom half of the land, or was that considered? Is just so I can get a bit of background, I suppose, really.
Worth going to the aerial view, if Louise could do that, or whoever's driving the machine.
Dan is.
It's as you can probably, I can't see because I haven't got my glasses on, but it's yeah. Look at the screen to my left. If you think about that boundary, if I may. If you made it smaller, you couldn't farm the bit that was left.
Yeah.
So I think it's a practical space, and it's also of an adequate size to give Freddie a sense of freedom, because I don't think he's going to play parks generally. This is because of his needs. He needs to play at home. So kids need to run around, and you need adequate space to do that, and particularly so in this case.
What you're saying is that it's not just about the play equipment, it's also about the space for him to run up and down, and because I noticed there was some
Pedal tractor.
Tractor.
Yeah,
Of course
pedal
it was a
tractor,
tractor.
like Daddy's
Of course
dog.
it was a tractor. So that he can do his farming in that space, as it were. Okay,
Safe
that's
farming.
fine. Just wanted to clarify it, that's all.
Any more questions? Councillor Hussain.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned about the site reverting back if permission was granted, that the site, you wouldn't have a problem with conditions being placed that you can't build on it, is that right? And that the site would then revert back to a field. But there's trees being planted on them. I'm guessing if you're there for 20, 30, 40 years, they will be established. So how would you then propose to revert it back?
Mate, Chairman, I think my suggestion was that if the committee felt it necessary, a planning condition of that nature could be imposed, but on the basis that the Sharpleys are highly unlikely to move away from the village that they've been in for 4 generations. But yes, it would necessitate taking up the hedges and taking out any trees to revert it back to land that you could farm. But that's a matter for the committee to consider. What we suggested is if you think that's absolutely necessary, then that would be a condition that would be reasonable to impose.
Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered, on the basis of that point, I wonder whether officers will clarify what the options are in relation to potential conditions in that area.
When we come to that
When you go
stage,
back to
officers' question,
I
you
think
can ask
it's
that question.
important in terms of the point while
Yeah.
it's live now. That's
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? No? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Now, any committee members have any questions for the officers that they could ask? Councillor Sharp?
Would you like me to repeat it, Louise? Or? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Should members be persuaded that the material consideration put forward by the applicant outweighs the harm that's identified through the departure of the local plan, members have full discretion to impose whatever planning conditions they see fit. That could include making the permission a personal permission to the applicant, tying the permission to the host dwelling house, a temporary permission, because you would be basing your assessment based on the specific needs of the child. When they're no longer a child, are they going to need the land? That's something for you to factor into your considerations. It's important to note we couldn't prevent any planting taking place because planting is not development and it's not covered by the Town and Country Planning Act. Therefore, we can't stop the applicant from planting trees or hedges or anything within that land. There is obviously a risk that, depending on how long a temporary consent may be granted for, that landscaping could well establish and become of biodiversity value, and therefore removing any planting that takes place could then cause harm in terms of ecology and biodiversity. So all of these things would need to factor into your determination in your debate as to whether you grant planning permission and impose any temporary restriction on that site. So I hope that helps, Councillor Sharp.
I suppose you've kind of almost answered my question. By permitting this application, do we then make it easier at a subsequent stage later on to be able to split that off as a building, because it's quite a sizable plot, that it could be split off as a building plot, or you could have another residence, even if it was not split off. Is that going to make it easier to be able to do so, is the point?
Not easy pressing these buttons today, are they? Apologies, through you, Chair. It depends how you condition down the use, Councillor Hogg, but if you don't make it a personal permission or if you don't make it temporary, that land would become lawfully residential curtilage, and an application could come forward tomorrow to put a house on that land. You know, the granting of it being garden land doesn't change the ability to do that. However, you would be establishing a new settlement boundary in the granting of this planning permission, and therefore a lot of the arguments that would weigh against a separate dwelling house being constructed on that site would be taken away as part of that. So it's not to say it would be a dead cert that planning permission would be granted for a new dwelling if that was put on the site, but it would establish a new settlement boundary if you were to grant planning permission.
As it's already there, is there any biodiversity value at present?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I wouldn't say that there is significant biodiversity value at present because none of the landscaping is heavily established and the trees, as you've seen in the photographs and on your site visit, aren't very established. But say, for example, you were to grant a 5 or 10 year temporary consent, then that would change the situation significantly.
Okay, Louise, if we was to pass this application, could it make a precedent for any other development in that village that we have permission to build on land that is not in the local plan?
Thank you, and through you, Chair. As members will be aware from the training that was given, there is no such thing as a legal precedent through any planning decision that you grant. However, planning decisions in the locality are a material planning consideration. It would depend on the very specific reasons given for allowing the departure from the local plan and whether that then could be used as an argument to allow similar departures in the locality.
Thank you, Chair. If temporary approval was granted, or this was accepted, could the applicant put any kind of building on there without approval, or would you be able to put conditions on it? That's like sometimes you get a garden, you can just put a 5 metre extension one without any sort of permission or whatever it is. So.
If permitted development rights were not removed by condition, the garden land would be subject to all permitted development rights attributable to a residential dwelling house under Part 1 of the General Permitted Development Order. That could include incidental outbuildings, swimming pools, such like, but there is the ability to impose a planning condition to remove those rights. However, what we can't control are those things that don't constitute development within the meaning of the Town and Country Planning Act. So that would be movable structures, general, garden and residential paraphernalia, toys, trampolines, that kind of thing. And also, as I alluded to earlier, planting. We can't control that because it's not covered by the Town and Country Planning Act.
I can do. Thank you. So I think that sort of Councillor Elsey bringing this is exactly what this committee is here for, to look through the specific rules, the black and white, and kind of fill out the colour. I thought that was quite a nice little phrase that you came up with, although it may have been used before, I don't know. So I think I have absolutely no problem with this application in terms of allowing the play equipment to exist and for it to be used. I as you're probably aware from the questions that I've already asked, that I do have concerns about the what ifs, the outside the box kind of thinking, what happens in the future. so I'm mindful of making sure that there are adequate conditions put in place to make sure that further development is not forthcoming. So I think in terms of removing the permitted development rights for this piece of land, it seems like a very sensible one to make sure that it is part of the curtilage of the existing property and it can't be split away again. And I'm not too concerned about it being a temporary measure. I think that will be fine in terms of whilst the family is in residence, and as you say, there's no plans for that to change. So I don't think there's going to be any issues with that from the applicant. So I think that would kind of tidy away to make sure that we've done our due diligence and we've done our job to make sure that we're not kind of encouraging people to extend village envelopes unduly. So yeah, I'm happy to support, but with kind of what recommendations that would be forthcoming from the debate, I think really is where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think I'm in a similar position. I mean, I started out at the beginning of this discussion. Well, obviously the black and white concern for the boundaries of the village, and especially given the background documents that were shared taking us back to 1900. The crux of it for me, though, is clearly the need of the child is demonstrable in terms of value against the application concerns that the officers have. And I think, personal view is I think that's been heavily demonstrated, especially taking into account the comments that Councillor Ugham is making around potential constraints and conditions. For me, I think we need to tread carefully over what those conditions are. However, there's some comments made in terms of what materials, what items could be left in that area that could be detrimental to the view of the village. And I guess for me, knowing how farming can be, there's nothing to stop the situation if that was reverted back to farmland. It could be disused trailers, it could be disused silage clamps, and so on. It could be an untidy view. So a temporary extension of the village for me is probably an adequate solution as long as it can be conditioned accordingly. So that, as I stand at the moment, I'm struggling to see any reason why we couldn't overturn this.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Similarly to Councillor Elsie, I'm a rural ward councillor, and LP2 is sort of emblazoned on my DNA, so to speak. So I'm very conscious of these applications, and I think this particular application is very much predicated on the personal circumstances of the applicant, and I think we should be very mindful of that. If we allow this development in open countryside, we are in effect, for however long, we are altering the status of the land. That I would be a complete anathema to me normally, but as I said, personal circumstances are pretty powerful in this case, and my take on this, and certainly from Councillor Elsie's very impassioned address, I absolutely am sympathetic to this, but I also am sympathetic to other councillors' concerns. Fears is probably too strong, but certainly concerns about the potential for future development on this land. And I think that I would support this application on the basis that certainly, as Councillor Hoggs alluded, that permitted development rights are removed, and this is conditioned very firmly to the potential future use of this land, whether that's a temporary permission. That's a terribly difficult one for me, because I don't know how these things work from a child, an autistic child growing into adulthood. I don't know how that works. I'm not a medical person. I've never experienced that scenario. So I think temporary could be difficult. If we're talking about personal consent, personal permission, or permission that goes with the property, I would leave that to our expert officers to advise us of that, having given it suitable consideration now, rather than at some time in the future. But certainly I am sympathetic to the case, to the application, and I would be supportive on the basis of that being put in place. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. We come to these committee meetings, and we talk about local plans, contrary to the village envelope, and agricultural land being eroded. But sometimes we have to sometimes think outside of the box, and personal circumstances sometimes perhaps and should come into it. And I think this time, because of the speakers and Mr. Sharpley himself saying about his little son, which we're all very sympathetic to, I'm sure, that I would go along with going against officer recommendation, approving this, as long as what Councillor Hiller has said, there's things put in there to safeguard our decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rush. Any more? Councillor Hussain?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, from the site visit initially, I would have said, you know, I was finding it difficult after reading the papers initially, just, you know, sort of to go against officers' recommendation. I will say Councillor Elsie's address has sort of swayed me a little bit, and the address by, you know, the comments made by Mr. Macham in regards to, you know, the restrictions that can be imposed or put on there has sort of alleviated those concerns for me. And one key thing that the father of the child said, which was, and I know this when we were on the site visit, I don't think there's any shops or amenities within that village, and there isn't a play area in that village for children. So I appreciate that, you know, that is something else that is needed at the moment. And again, as my colleagues have said, if the conditions are put in place, I would then be in favour of this application.
Thank you, Councillor Hussain. Any more debate? No? Can I have a proposal then? Councillor Hiller.
Thank you, Chair. I propose Louise gives us an outline of what conditions could be put in place before I propose. Thank you, Chair. And I do have a proposal once I've listened to Louise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So the conditions that could be imposed to restrict the development in line with what we've heard at debate. Yes. Yes, so the recommended conditions would be making it a personal permission to the applicant only, provided that they reside at the property known as 16 Russell Hill, and that the land is used in conjunction with the residential dwelling of 16 Russell Hill. You could impose a temporary planning permission. You could impose a condition which removes permitted development rights under Part 1 and Part 2, because that would also include any further fences or any other structures that may appear harmful to the character of the area. You could also secure the landscape establishment condition for the landscaping that has been put in place if you feel that that is appropriate to do so.
Thank you for that, Louise. I think from a landscaping point of view, you did talk earlier on, if you'll allow me, Chair, about planting. And I would imagine, given the land husbandry that the applicant has probably in his DNA, I wouldn't have any issues with that whatsoever that would be appended to any proposal that I have. So I would be relieved, I think, on that aspect. But I think you've outlined, you know, pretty much where I'm, and I suggest potentially some of my colleagues are coming from here. It is about protection of the village. It is also about protection of our local plan policies, and I'm very concerned and conscious, as I say, as a rural ward councillor in particular, that those conditions aren't written roughshod over, and I don't think we would be doing that. Certainly I wouldn't be doing that in any proposal that I had. I would be protecting those policies I think for all the right reasons, and indeed for the reasons put forward by certainly the ward councillor, Councillor Elsey, and the applicant, and Mr Machin, of course. So with your permission, Chair, that would be my proposal with the appended conditions as outlined by Louise.
Thank you.
So it would be personal permission to the applicant, tied to the host dwelling house known as 16 Russell Hill, and removal of permitted development rights under Part 1 and Part 2, and a temporary permission. How long for, Councillor Hiller, would be the key question I would have.
Well, I suppose the answer to that would probably be 10 years, which I would suggest, unless somebody has a violent disagreement with this, I would suggest 10 years is probably a sensible period. That's not to suggest that couldn't be reapplied after 10 years, of course. I would also like the condition to mention that this would be peculiar to the child. So any equipment, any stuff that's put in that land would probably appertain to the well-being of the child. Is that possible, or would you need medical support, evidence to support that?
I will be honest, I'm not convinced that would meet the tests that a planning condition should meet.
Your advice on that, so I would redact that. Thank you, Chair.
So are we happy with 10 years? Is that what... Sorry, Councillor, you wanted to say something?
So I was just going to say that I know that the applicant has mentioned another child at the age of 1 or a newborn. Is that right? So obviously, when children are assessed, they're a little bit older. So I'm not saying, that the other child would have these issues or anything like that. But rather than going through that whole process again, would it not be more pertinent to say 15 years rather than 10? Or is that?
It's your proposal, Councillor Hiller. Sorry.
Obviously, we're here in an advisory capacity. My advice would be, when you start erring past 10 years, it has an akin to permanence, and you have to make a judgment about whether you're then granting a permanent permission. 10 years is pushing the limits, in my professional opinion, but I think we could make an argument based on the current specific personal circumstances, and, there is the opportunity, as Councillor Hill has pointed out, where the applicant could choose to renew the planning permission, and we would assess it again.
Councillor Hiller.
Yes, I'm comfortable with that, Chair. As I said in my previous comments, this application is predicated purely on the personal circumstances of this particular young individual, and I think we need to be very conscious of that. You're absolutely right. Again, as I mentioned before, this can be reapplied for, and you've confirmed that, of course. So I think on the basis of that, I would stick to 10 years. I think 10 years is probably the limit that I would be comfortable.
Thank you. So we've got a proposal
from a planning committee point of view.
So everybody's clear about the proposal? Do we have a seconder? Councillor Rush. Are you happy to second?
Yeah, I'm happy to second Councillor Hiller's proposal, and with the conditions attached as have been said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now move to the vote. If members can raise their hands for those in favour. Now those against? And finally, abstentions. Thank you, members. Dan, please, can you read the results?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the result is to go against officer's recommendation and grant the application with the conditions attached.
Thank you. Thank you. Members, would you like a comfort break for about five minutes? If that's okay. I need one. They're ready to convene. Right, can we start? Can we make a start now, please? Agenda item 4.3. Can I ask Louise Summers to introduce the item, please? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. This third application before you members seeks retrospective planning permission for the change of use of a parcel of agricultural land to extend the residential garden of holiday accommodation at Crawford Farm in Thornl. This slide shows the application site edged in red. The land subject to the change of use is located to the east of the site known as Crawford Farm. Within the site is the main farmhouse, which adjoins a barn which has been converted into 2 holiday cottages, which were granted permission back in 2019. This slide shows the policy context of the application site. It might seem familiar to you. As you will see, the host property is located within the identified settlement envelope of Thornl in yellow, and blue, and the conservation area in yellow. Croft Farm is a Grade 2 listed building, and the holiday cottages and application site are located partially within its curtilage. The land subject to the change of use is located outside the settlement boundary and is therefore, in planning policy terms, open countryside. The site is sensitive in terms of heritage context, with several other listed buildings within the locality, identified in orange. This slide shows an aerial photograph of the site. Immediately to the north is the residential dwelling of Apple Grove, with numbers 8 and 10 Meadow Lane to the west. To the south is a parcel of undeveloped agricultural land with access onto Meadow Lane, with number 14 Meadow Lane beyond. The site is bound to the east by agricultural arable fields. Shaded in yellow on this slide is the current garden area serving the holiday cottages, and shaded in green is the garden area serving Crawford Farm farmhouse. The existing areas combined total some 689 square metres, whilst the additional garden area sought by this application extends to some 585 square metres. It therefore represents almost doubling of the existing garden area. This slide shows the approved layout from the 2019 permission to convert the barn to holiday accommodation and clearly shows the 2 garden areas. Turning to look at photographs of the site, this shows the approach of the application site from the north. The holiday lets are to the right of the photograph, with the neighbouring dwellings to the left, and Apple Grove has been pointed out to you. The extended garden area is in the background beyond the building. Panning into the site, this shows the relationship to the agricultural fields to the east of the site, with the holiday accommodation to the far right-hand side, just shown. And here there's the garden land, which is subject to the retrospective application, with the holiday accommodation to the right. Members will note the open nature of the site, which does not benefit from any screening to the open countryside. And then looking northwards back across the site, you'll note Apple Grove and the relationship to the holiday cottages, Croft Farmhouse and the application site. And this again shows the relationship of the site to the open countryside beyond to the east. And then this photograph, which doesn't show the application site as such, but it does show the relationship to numbers 8, 10 and 14 Meadow Lane. The application site is just off the photograph to the right-hand side. Turning to look at the historic maps of Thornl, this is the map from 1900, and there is a clearly defined boundary to the eastern side of the village abutting the side elevation of the barn, which is the L-shaped building in the map. And this is the 1967, clearly again showing the defined settlement boundary. The Parish Council of Thornl has objected to the application, again owing to its position outside the settlement boundary. As with the last application determined, policy LP2 of the local plan sets out the spatial strategy for development within Peterborough. And as you will recall, any development which doesn't meet the criteria within the policy is, by definition, wholly contrary to the local plan. There are no material considerations in the opinion of officers that weigh in favour of the proposal or allowing the departure from the local plan in this instance. Therefore, our position is that the principle of development is wholly unacceptable. In addition to the concerns regarding principle, officers also have concerns with regards to the impact of the character of the area. This is supported by an objection from the Council's Conservation Officer. As has been evidenced on preceding slides, the eastern village boundary is historic, and any encroachment beyond results in harm to the historic setting of both the village and the conservation area. Encroachment into the countryside on this scale unacceptably blurs the line between the built form and the countryside. The size and scale of the land to be changed, or that has changed into residential garden to serve the holiday lets, is too large and out of character with the size and scale of the holiday lets it would serve. The setting of the conservation area and listed buildings would, in our opinion, be harmed. Furthermore, the garden land would be bound to the south by agricultural land, which would then form an awkward and contrived form to the settlement boundary. As with the previous application, in the terms of the NPPF, the harm to heritage assets would be less than substantial, but that's not to say that it wouldn't be considerable. The NPPF then requires us to balance that harm against public benefits. Officers are of the opinion that there are no public benefits arising from the development. Therefore, the harm is not outweighed in any way. In addition to character concerns, officers are also very concerned regarding the impact to neighbour amenity. 6 objections have been received from 5 households on various matters, but primarily the objections relate to noise and general disturbance arising from the use of the land as garden space associated with the holiday lets. Historically, the land has been agricultural use, and that therefore affords neighbouring occupiers with a quiet level of amenity which they should reasonably expect within their gardens and homes. Use as garden land, without doubt, brings about added noise and disturbance, particularly with regards to holiday lets, which bring about a higher turnover of occupants, and generally, those occupants are not bound by the relationships with neighbours in the same way as permanent occupiers. Therefore, the inclination to be more respectful of quiet amenity falls away. This has certainly been the case according to the objections received from local residents. Officers are of the view that the change of use results in unacceptable harm to the amenities of neighbouring occupants. Therefore, taking all of this into account, we're of the view that the proposal is unacceptable and wholly contrary to the adopted development plan, as well as causing harm to the character and appearance of the area, heritage assets and neighbour amenity. There are no material considerations that indicate otherwise, and therefore our recommendation to you today is one of refusal for the reasons set out within the main report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We have 3 people registered to speak on this item. Please can I ask Councillor Elsie, Ward Councillor, to address the committee. You will have 10 minutes in which to address the committee. The Democratic Services Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left and when the 10 minutes have lapsed. When you are ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I have got something to read out, but before I do, can I just say that something that you said, Louise, was technically incorrect. You said that it was not shielded in any way on that boundary. Well, halfway down there, there's a falling down wall, and there's also a disused shed. So it is shielded from the open countryside, partly. This application is not dissimilar to the application just heard relating to 16 Russell Hill. The officer's recommendation for refusal, as a matter of principle, is semantics at its best. Again, they state this is unjustified development in open countryside and is technically outside the village boundary. This is only the case because when the conservation area was drawn up, the line was put in the wrong place. If you visited the site, you would have seen that this small parcel of land was quite clearly part of the farmyard, to such an extent it still has the base of a cowshed in it, with all the drainage veins and scars of use clear to see. I would also add that when this was pointed out to the original planning officer, he accused the Sharpleys of installing it for effect, which was total nonsense. The Sharpleys are a local farming family with a long connection to the village. They've supported the village and its economy for generations. Rural villages such as Thornl are not museums or gated retirement communities. They're places with working people and businesses. They constitute the rural economy. Alongside being the mainstay in our food chain, it is now also essential for farms to diversify and generate the necessary income to maintain their farm estate and to financially support farming families and communities. Like the previous application, the key planning issues in this case are the principle of development, the visual impact on the proposal on the character of the area, residential amenity, and the impact on heritage assets. In terms of the principle of development, the officer report makes the same assessment as in the previous application. It claims that the proposal represents unjustified development in the open countryside and should be refused as a matter of principle. There is no development. The area is and will remain mown grass, which is utterly impractical to farm. The site is technically outside the village boundary and thus classed as open countryside. However, the site area suggested has the same eastern boundary as the rear gardens of houses to the immediate south or Meadow Lane, which form the village boundary. On the second issue, impact on character and appearance, officers refer to permitted development rights being exercised in the future. Planning conditions can be imposed preventing any buildings, hard surfaced areas, other than the one which already exists and should remain as a heritage feature, or chattels being located on the site to ensure it remains in its open appearance. Turning to impact on heritage assets, the officer report concludes that there would be less than substantial harm, the statutory test. It goes on to state that there are negligible public benefits arising from the development and that the main benefit is to the applicant and their dependents. Holiday accommodation is fast becoming a substantial type of farm diversification. It has become ever more important since the COVID-19 pandemic and the chaotic foreign holiday industry. This is an application to use surplus land which was originally part of the farmyard to provide outside amenity space for the existing holiday cottages. These cottages support the local economy, from the money visitors spend locally to the people employed to maintain them and the business rates that they generate. There is a clear public benefit. Again, like the previous application, the site is technically just outside the village envelope. It is not true open countryside and cannot be physically farmed. There would be less than substantial harm to heritage assets and continued public benefit to the local economy that would outweigh any such harm. Once again, I asked you to look through the black and white for the colour. This is a walled piece of land with mowed grass, and if the application is successful, it will become a walled piece of land with mowed grass. The only difference is the ability for a small number of people to use this mowed grass for recreational purposes, where at present they can't. Once again, I ask for common sense to prevail. Thank you.
Any questions? Councillor Hiller.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And hello again, Councillor Elsey. You make the assertion, I think you made it several times, that this land isn't currently being used. It appears from the report, however, the comments of the objectors say exactly the opposite. It is being used. It is being used to their detriment. They cite ball games, inflatable castles, shrieking dogs, parties, all sorts of loud music. And so would you concede that it is slightly disingenuous to suggest that it's not being used currently? Just a question.
I don't believe that I did say it wasn't being used. What I said was it was impractical to farm it, and I said that at this moment in time it is a mowed piece of lawn, and it will remain, if this application goes through, a mowed piece of lawn. I never said that it isn't being used, and I've seen the objections, and I go to the Thornl Parish Council meetings, and I've been approached by a number of people who are neighbouring residents, and there has been noise. I completely concede that, and Mr. Sharpley has done his best to curtail that once it has been made aware to him. However, the objections that, in my opinion, the objections that I've heard, and doubtless the objections that you've seen, relate to activities that go on at the holiday lets, not on that piece of land specifically. And if people are minded that they're going to be rowdy in a holiday let, and the holiday let has a garden whichever side of this particular fence it's on, they will continue to do so, because unreasonable people are unreasonable people. So whether it was on that piece of land or whether it was on the current contained garden, it would still have an impact on the neighbours. So I don't believe that in allowing this piece of land, which is actually further away from most of the properties, would have an increased impact on the behaviour of the small minority who spoil it for the silent majority.
Thank you for that detailed response. If I might, Chair, thank you, and through you, it appears the objectors don't necessarily agree with everything you've said, and I completely get that this is anecdotal, and and it's people's own impressions and views. Would you? I mean, one of the reasons you've referred this to the committee is for the need, and I quote, the need for economic growth and the benefits of farm diversification. Would you not suggest that for 2 holiday lets, the existing garden with the hot tub and the lawned area is sufficient for that? Would you not think that the extra land is probably unnecessary given the contentious nature of the change of status of that land?
What I would say is that if I went to a holiday let with the management and I told her she was sharing a garden with somebody that she didn't know, so therefore if she wanted to sit out and she wanted to enjoy the peace and tranquility of the garden, she'd be doing it with other people, she would be far from impressed. So I think that there's an argument to say that having separate gardens and separate space for people to be able to enjoy themselves is a material consideration.
Councillor, I think the question you've asked, Councillor Elsie, would be good if you asked the applicant. I think you'll be able to answer it better than Councillor Elsie. Thank you. Any more questions? No? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Thank you. Please can I ask Simon Machin and Peter Sharpley to address the committee. You will have 5 minutes between you in which to address the committee. The Democratic Services Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left and then when the 5 minutes have lapsed. When you're ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not going to read my statement out. I'm just going to focus on 3 issues, which I think are the pertinent planning issues in this case. The first is the suggested impact on heritage assets, the conservation area character, setting of listed buildings, etc. And I fail to see how the conservation area can be affected, or any listed building is affected in any way, because there is no physical development proposed, so there will be no visual change to the setting of those heritage assets. As Councillor Elsie mentioned, it's currently mown grass and it will remain mown grass, and you can take away permitted development rights to prevent any structures, hard surfaces, etc. from being constructed. So I don't think heritage impact is an issue at all in this case. Turning to the open countryside position in the principle of development, I very much suspect that the settlement boundary here, if Louise, or sorry, Daniel could go to the slide that shows the settlement boundary, which is the blue line. If anybody were drawing a line of where the village is, it would be up the field boundary north-south. I think that piece of land, which as you can see from that photograph was the working farmyard, has been intentionally excluded so that nobody can build any houses in it. That's why it's outside the village boundary. It's not, and has never in living memory been, part of a field. You can see from that it's a farmyard, and I'm sure Mr. Sharpley will add in a few moments that he couldn't possibly farm it. You couldn't get an agricultural machine in there to do anything with it. So in terms of encroachment into the open countryside, technically it is, but in terms of the intrinsic quality and beauty of the open countryside to which the MPPF alludes, I don't think anyone could say that this is the rolling fields of England. It's a farmyard legacy with some hard surfaces on it from buildings that previously occupied it. On the third point of impact on residential amenity, I did make a specific point of emailing the case officer, Connor Lycan, on the 10th of June to request information, redacted in terms of GDPR, of the number and frequency of complaints made to the council's environmental health department about noise nuisance or antisocial behaviour from this site. I've yet to receive a response from Connor Lycan, the case officer, but on the basis I've had no response, I would have to assume that there have been no complaints made to the council, and I'm sure Mr Sharpley would be aware if any such complaints had been made, because they would have been made to him as the owner of the business. So we have 5 Thornl residents out of something like 400 people in the village objecting to this proposal, plus the parish council, whose main concern seems to be about encroachment into the open countryside, which technically it is, but in visual terms I would argue it's not. So Chairman, I think this is very different to the last application, which was very much going into a field. This isn't going into a field because there's a field boundary to the right of it, and we've intentionally kept the site area smaller than the whole area available so that the impact upon neighbours is minimised, and so that the view from Meadow Lane through the field access is maintained as is. So on balance, Chairman, I think there's very little impact arising from this proposal. Mr Sharpley will add anything further. Thank you.
Good afternoon all again. Yeah, just going for that statement. My sprayer on the farm is 36 metres wide. I physically wouldn't be able to back into that area in order to put arable crops in there. So if I couldn't farm it from an arable crop husbandry point of view, I'd have to do something else. And I'm short of putting livestock in there, which I'm sure the neighbours wouldn't be appreciative either. That space is very much unusable for me. I currently cut the grass on it like I do in the farmyard to keep the weeds down, keep it neat, keep it tidy. Yes, one of the holiday cottage guests approached me and said, can we have a bouncy castle? Unfortunately, it wouldn't fit in the designated garden. I said, we'll put it there. It's out of the way, it's away from the village. So having this site further to the east of the holiday cottages will keep guests
Just a reminder,
away
30
from
seconds
the village.
left.
Is that it? Time off, is it?
30 seconds.
Sorry?
Got 30 seconds left.
Oh, okay, I'm pretty much done. Just to say, keep the noise and guests away from the rest of the village to the east. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Do any members of the committee wish to ask a question? Councillor Hiller?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon again, Mr Sharpley. Just a point of clarification, really, Mr Sharpley. Councillor Elsey made the valid comment that if, that your lets are in fact available to unconnected tenants to rent. It rather it opposes what's been said here, and again this is anecdotal, I suppose, because these are the words of the objectors, but they do say the barns, the original permission, following granting of the original permission, Croft Farm itself was turned into a holiday let, apparently not requiring any form of permission. Talk about the hot tub and whatever, and a complex of 3 units being used as a party venue for 18 people. The 3 properties, although advertised as single lets, can only be booked together, therefore accommodating up to 80 people. Is that actually true? Can they only be booked together? Is that right?
Yes, it is, yeah. From what Sykes, who we do all our bookings, tell us, there's a shortage of larger properties. To address the issue of parties, we've told them ban single-sex parties, ban anything which would include a party, hen parties, stag do's, anything like that. So family gatherings is what we go for. But yes, we go for that now.
Can't be booked individually then? No,
but
okay.
If they were booked individually, we'd still have the same amount of people on site.
Confused. So you can't, are you saying you can't book them individually?
At the moment, no.
You can't?
No, if you go on the Sykes website, it's all booked as one site.
Okay, so everybody would be connected and friendly and hopefully know each other and whatever. So that rather discounts the argument of having, that Councillor Elsey asserted. You talk about parties and not allowing parties, but that doesn't appear to be the case with some of the objections as reported here, that parties still continue, and I cite loud music and bouncy castles and that sort of thing. Does that not happen? Or are you denying this happens?
We have got a curfew on the site for 11 p.m. I have spoke to the Pollution Control Department in Peterborough City Council to ask if they had any other suggestions so we don't upset anyone, and they've not had any complaints. They've not had any suggestions that neighbours have had the noise, and they further said that you could put in your terms and conditions that automatic removal from site if they do party. Therefore, I keep an eye on them. Basically.
But you've had complaints yourself, of course.
Personally, I've had people texting me, but I've also had people text me from the village that I farm late at night, including people of the parish council. So, from this point of view, yes, we've had neighbours say to me, but they've not complained to pollution control. So,
okay, well, you've said that several times, as Mr. Machin said that, which I accept as valid, of course, but you personally have had complaints about the noise and disruption from the tenants in your holiday lets.
Which I've dealt with, yes.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Thank you. You may now return to your seat in the public gallery. Any questions for officers, members? No? If there are no questions, then we could go straight to the debate. Who would like to start the debate? Councillor Hiller?
Thank you, Chair. I think we've got a very different application here. Whilst it's being cited as a better, inverted commas, application from a land change of use point of view, we don't have anything like, in my opinion, the driving argument for looking at this favourably and going against our officer's recommendation. This is a commercial operation. I've just been scribbling some notes down here as I've been listening to the addresses. With residents, let's not forget the residents of this village. And Councillor Elsey, as the very conscientious ward councillor, will be aware there's always two sides to this argument. And the side I have to fall down on, I'm afraid, is amenity loss. And it appears that from the comments, albeit anecdotal, but people have actually made the effort to put these comments in writing to our officers, that disruption occurs, and it occurs on this bit of land that we are looking to change the use of. Now, the physicality of the land has been said on more than one occasion with the addresses, both from the agent, the owner, and Councillor Elsey. The physicality of the land won't change. It is a mowed grass, fenced in, that ain't going to change. But what happens on that land, the permissible development, if you will, it's going to be a party area that exists already. We're just almost sanctioning that, and I think that's wrong, frankly. These holiday lets, and I'm sure they're lovely holiday lets, in a lovely spot in a beautiful village, and they have a garden, they have an amenity space within the curtilage of what is there already. With the hot tub and the nice lawn, and it's almost like a walled effect that would almost protect to a great degree some of the, if not all of the noise and associated activities from the surrounding neighbours, or certainly the neighbours that are close. So I'm finding it very difficult, I think, to go anywhere with this other than support our officer's recommendation at this juncture, Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Hiller. Anybody else? Councillor Hogg.
Thank you, Chair. So I have to agree with Councillor Hiller. I think this is a completely different ballgame when it comes to the previous application. I can see the argument for saying that maybe the lines should have been drawn differently when they were drawn up, but they weren't, and it is what it is, and in terms of amenity loss, by allowing this application does this mean there'll be more bouncy castles? Does this mean there'll be more disruption for neighbours? Will there be more loud parties and outside of the kind of the walled curtilage of the existing property? And I think the answer to that is yes. Yes, there will be. So unfortunately, much as I can see the kind of logic of going, well, actually there's that line there, and it should have been a straight line. That's not what is before us, and that's not what has been in place for quite considerable amount of time. So on that basis, I can't support the application, and I would be looking to go with the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Hogg. Anybody else? Councillor Hussain?
I agree with Councillor Hogg. Looking at the map, yes, the natural boundary for me would have been the field boundary, but that's not what we're here to discuss. We're talking about a parcel of land. Yes, you can't farm it, I agree, but at the same time, with the holiday let, it's a commercial entity, as has been stated, from the roads, from the motorways, I think the A47, the A1, if you looked over and you saw big bouncy castles in the background, beautiful farmhouse, beautiful old buildings, it does have an impact on them. It does have a heritage impact for me, The neighbouring properties have already complained, and the walls with the garden areas where they are currently, they are walled in, and if they're already having an effect on neighbours from there in regards to noise and the parties or whatever that are happening at the holiday lets, then you're bringing that out more into the open, and that will definitely have a detrimental effect on the neighbours and their living standards. So I'm with exactly. I concur with Councillor Hill on what he's said, and I'm with officers on this.
Any further debate? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's one word that I'm really concerned about: is material consideration. There's nothing there that outweighs that we should distance ourselves from the local plan. From the previous application is totally different. There's no comparison. So on that basis, I'm also minded to support the officer's recommendation. Now, as the debate has finalised, can I have a proposer? Councillor Hiller.
Yes, I'd be comfortable with proposing that we accept the officer's recommendation without reservation, frankly. Thank you.
Would like to second it? Councillor Hogg, sorry. We'll now move to the vote. If members can raise their hands for those in favour. Yep. Now, those against. And finally, abstentions. Right. Thank you, members. Dan, please, can you read the results?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the result is the application is refused as per the officer recommendation.
Thank you. Agenda item 4.4. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Chair, just before Louise goes, can I just say something?
Yes, we would like to.
I understand Louise is leaving the end of August, and I thank her for the help she's given me for over the years, and I expect she's given lots of councillors much help as possible. I just hope you do well in your new assignment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we should give her a round of applause. Thank you. You're welcome. Probably sitting over there. Item 4.4. Please can I ask Mike Osborne to introduce the item?
Thank you, Chair. So, if you can put me on the slide, please, thank you. I assume most of you went to the site visit on Friday, but to run you through the site background briefly, Sages Tower, you'll be familiar with, is a local building of historic interest. Originally sat on the site of a wider industrial development that has since been replaced by the surrounding residential development that was the subject of a planning permission in 2011. Next slide, please. So we've just got a few photographs of the site from when I visited the site, but obviously you'll have seen it as well. So if you can skip through to the next ones, please. What you'll have seen from the site is it's been dormant for a number of years now, and it's unfortunately been the subject to antisocial behaviour in recent times as graffiti. The site perimeter has been broken into, and we've received a number of representations during the application to that effect as well. This is just a last photograph in the pack, really, just to give you a sense of some of the surrounding development of the site, the adjacencies. This is what you see from the tower if you were looking back down the drive. Next slide, thank you. And so what we have is a proposal before us that actually was granted consent in 2018, and this is an identical proposal to that, but I'll run you through the details quickly. So in the 2011 consent for the site, next slide please. Sorry, that's the tower as it stands today. Next one. We had a consent to when the Wire estate was granted consent. There was a proposal that was also approved to convert the tower into 2 flats, which is what this image here shows you. That didn't proceed with the residential scheme, as is obvious from the site. And that was then replaced by the subsequent consent in 2018, which expanded the tower, added an extension, and converted the tower into 4 units of residential accommodation. That consent lapsed earlier this year, and hence the reason for this application coming forwards now, in the sense that with it being a time-limited permission without renewing the consent, then the tower would sit there either in its undeveloped form or, in theory, the 2011 consent is still extant, but that's not that. So for the reasons that hasn't come forward before, it hasn't come forward again now. So I just wanted to focus members' minds really on the fact that this is an identical proposal to the 2018 consent in all senses of the scheme, and that scheme received approval previously. So in considering the proposal and the merits of that, you need to bear in mind that when we look to the application, we have to consider whether there have been any material change of circumstances since that original consent was granted, and our assessment of the situation is there have not. So that's the reason for the officer recommendation before you now. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one person registered to speak on this item. Please can I ask Councillor Sanford, Ward Councillor, to address the committee. You will have 10 minutes in which to address the committee. The Democratic Services Officer will let you know when you have 30 seconds left, and then when the 10 minutes have lapsed. When you're ready, if you can please switch on your mic and start speaking. Thank you.
It is working, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm one of the 3 ward councillors that represent Preston and Walton, and I think it's fair to say this particular application site has been a bit of a thorn in the side of local people and local councillors over a considerable period of time. I'm not here to oppose the actual application. In fact, I would actually like to see it go ahead as quickly as possible. But I just want to put over some of the concerns that local people have put to me and the other councillors, and perhaps talk to you about some of the conditions that you might want to impose. If you turn to page 79 of your report, it lists the objections or comments that local people put forward, and I just want to talk about a few of them. Some people say the tower should have been removed completely. Other people are concerned about about the impact on car parking, and there's a number of people concerned about overlooking of their properties, and there is quite a major concern about the condition of the site and the length of time that the implementation of the consent has actually taken. I think we can dismiss the point about removing the tower. There was one of the previous owners of the site wanted to remove it, and he applied for the council, but the council decided that it had sufficient cultural and historic importance that it needed to be kept. I think we can also dismiss the concerns about the car parking. I think there is an adequate amount of car parking being provided, and there's also quite a large supermarket car park is actually quite close for any people coming to see the actual occupants. So I just want to focus more on the two major concerns. There were quite a few people in the locality have actually come to us as ward councillors, and they look at the size of the tower and they look at the extension that is proposed, and they have severe concerns about overlooking into their properties. And you need to look. I think it's paragraph A of policy LP 17, which talks about the need to protect the amenity of occupiers of existing properties. I appreciate that what you can do at this committee is a bit constrained by what happened at the previous committee, but I just wanted to point out to you that there's a couple of properties are mentioned, one in Windsor Avenue and one in Frederick, but I've also been approached by people in Balmoral Road at the end that is closest to the property, that they've also got concerns, and some of them are not entirely convinced that the previous conditions for the obscuring of some of the windows will mean that their properties can't be overlooked. Obviously, I appreciate that's a matter of opinion, but I would hope that you would do as much as you can in terms of imposing conditions to try and protect those people from having their properties overlooked. But I think the most important thing I want to talk to you about is the condition of the site. It's the actual former water tower has been in an appalling condition probably for about a 20-year period. In the past, up to the housing development being constructed, it was part of a much larger site that was in an appalling condition, but at least the site was secure. There was one of the local people actually resorted to shooting some of the pigeons that were making their home in the tower. But I think since the housing development was constructed, you've now got what is quite an attractive new housing development, which has got this derelict tower plonked in the centre. And there was planning permission for development in 2011. There was a further consent in 2018, but none of those have actually been implemented. I think the planning officer mentioned, has there been a material change since the 2018 consent was granted? The material change is that the condition of the tower has deteriorated even further. And we actually got to a point about 12 months ago that we approached the council's enforcement team, and we're really, on behalf of local residents, pressing them to take action, because the owner of the site wasn't properly securing it. There was allegations of drugs were being dealt in the area. There was concern about children possibly getting in and sort of injuring themselves. It wasn't safe, it wasn't secure. And we even got to a point when Matt Gladstone was going around on his walk tours, he said, "Can you show me the places of interest in your ward?" And we took him to this site, and he was absolutely appalled at the condition of it. I think the council legal department has been really slow to take enforcement action. We are still pressing them on that. So I think you're probably going to say to me, what is your ask? Well, I think, if you are going to grant planning permission for this, can you at least grant it for a relatively short period? Because I think if you give them another 3 or 5 years consent, we could be back here in 3 or 5 years' time with the tower in an even worse condition. I think in conclusion, I just say, this is probably the most appalling site in the council ward that I represent. It's an embarrassment to Peterborough City Council. So I would just ask you to, just take into account the feelings of the people in that particular area who have to live over a considerable period of time with this actual eyesore. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sanford. Do any of the committee members have any questions for Councillor Sanford? No? Thank you. In that case, if you could take a seat in the public gallery. Do any members have any questions for officers? Councillor Hogg.
Just a quick question around the suggestion by Councillor Sanford in terms of, is there a mechanism by which we can limit the time that this planning is available to them so that they can get a move on? Or are we just stuck with the usual?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think we need to be a little bit careful in terms of considering shortening the period of consent, because while I've had conversations offline with the applicants about their intentions, and obviously one of the reasons that they've given informally is that the situation the world has found itself in for the last couple of years has been quite challenging, and that's impacted their ability to get on with the scheme. We know from the construction industry, for example, the supply of materials is quite challenging, long lead-in times and bits and pieces like that. So I don't think it's we have the sense that they've not wanted to get on with it, but there have been barriers in the way for that. So if we look to unreasonably shorten the period of consent, we could find ourselves in a position where we're entertaining another application in 12 months' time because other barriers have still presented themselves that meant they haven't been able to implement the consent in that period of time. I think if we were looking at putting conditions on a consent that compelled them to do it, I think we'd struggle with some of the reasonableness tests because of those same sort of constraints that impacts an individual's ability to get on with it, if that makes sense.
I suspected that would be the case, but I just wanted to explore to make sure that we'd explored the councillor's concerns.
Thank you, Councillor Hogg. Any more questions? Councillor Hiller?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mike, for the response to Councillor Hogg's query. My question to you is, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it is locally listed, this tower. Could you explain to the committee members what the status of that is? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And so a local listing isn't the same as a listing by Historic England, but it means that the local conservation team have identified the building having particular value in the local area. So architecturally, it's not necessarily of a strong value, but it has an identity within the community, and it was considered to be an important landmark that should be retained for that reason.
Councillor Hogg. Any more questions to the officers? If there are no more questions, can we go to the debate then? Who's going to start the debate? Councillor Hogg.
So, I mean, this has already been before us and has been approved. I'm happy to approve it. I think that's the long and short of it. For once, I have been brief.
Thank you, Councillor Hiller.
I'm still getting over the shock, frankly, of Councillor Hogg's brief address. Waiting for the follow-up. Joking aside, serious matters. I think Councillor Sanford's address was informative. A lot of it, most of it, wasn't planning related, I have to say, to what we've got in front of us this afternoon. But he makes some very valid comments as a ward councillor, concerned that this edifice, this locally listed tower, is there moribund. And when we went up on Friday, I reacquainted myself with this, I think, rather beautiful tower, but it is in a pretty sorry state currently. Yes, I think it's fairly obvious that we need to renew this consent, in my opinion. If we don't, then it's, we'll just go to appeal, I'm sure, and that appeal will be upheld. So, where are we going with that? So I think, we do need to renew this consent. The conversion looks pretty good from what we've seen. Attractive apartments to finish this development, and I think that, yes, the tower will be occupied by people. But it's been there for over 100 odd years. The development's been there for how long? 4 or 5 years. I don't know how old it is, but it's terribly easy to move into a property with a tower in front of you and then start complaining about the tower. Hello. We just need to get on with this. The developer, the owners need to get on with this, whether they're going to develop it themselves or whether they're going to put it on the market or whatever. It's crying out to be completed, finished and occupied. So I think, without further ado, let's get on with it. Thank you, Chair.
Any further debate? I think from Councillor Sanford's address, he just wants some sort of persuasion to the applicant so he could get and move on and get done with it. I think that's what the message I got from his address. Surely I think you could probably have a word. But in terms of planning, there's nothing we could do. Right. As the debate has concluded, can we have a proposal, please? Councillor Hogg.
You approve the application in line with the officer's recommendations.
Thank you. Can I also have a seconder? Councillor Hussain. Okay, all those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? No? Dan, all over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the committee has resolved to grant the application as per the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, and that's it for today.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.